Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're located, and welcome to my presentation about security in Jakarta EE 11. So first, a little bit about myself for those who haven't heard or met me. I work as a coach, open source evangelist, software architect, and full stack or cloud native developer. I'm author of a couple of books. I'll also come to those towards the end of the talk, and regular speaker at conferences, both online and now also sometimes in person again. I lead 2 GSRs for money and units of measurement, and I was also recently re-elected to serve in the Jakarta EE specification committee as the committer representative. So here the disclaimer about the Jakarta EE 11 status. It's actually supposed to go live right after Jakarta live stream, while the individual specs, including the ones that I will talk about, are already final for quite some time. So the security specs in Jakarta EE are separated into 3. The most important one that you will probably usually deal with is Jakarta security, but there are also 2 underlying specs for authentication and authorization, which may be merged in a future Jakarta EE version. Whether that's going to be 12 or later, we shall see, but eventually, I guess you might probably just see one big Jakarta security spec. So some of the common principles that existed for some releases now is to simplify the security programming model, enable developers more easily to manage security, and the layered APIs that point to one another, although eventually to make a more unified impression and usability, and to use CDI wherever possible. Jakarta security specs can be used both in a declarative way or programmatically. The Jakarta security spec is a way to create secure applications. It standardizes terminology, which has been defined for some time now, even in the time when this was still in the Java community process. It includes an API for authentication mechanisms, an identity store, a security context, and an API for role permission management. Jakarta Authentication is a portable SPI that is used to authenticate. It abstracts the particular identity store against which the application wants to authenticate. It offers a simple configuration, and it's extensible to support other protocols like OAuth or OpenID Connect, most of which have already been included out of the box since Jakarta EE 10. And it produces a consistent representation of an authenticated subject. It also offers authentication events like logged in, logged out, or failures. And it is an evolution of the initial JASPIC GSR, which was first filed under the GSR number 196. Jakarta authorization is also a lower level SPI for authorization modules. It offers an SPI for authorization policies and to configure those policies, a factory to create and retrieve policy configurations, and an SPI for the policy context. Now let's look at what has changed in Jakarta EE 11. So except for authentication, all specs got a major version upgrade. Jakarta security is now in version 4, in version 3, and Jakarta authentication has the smallest changes, which are mostly marginal, particularly around Java SE changes. That's why it only got a 3.1 upgrade. So some cross-cutting concerns you may also have heard in earlier talks. First, to increase the usage of CDI, managed beans 2 have been removed in favor of CDI. And then what's of course to particular concern for the security specs is that Java SE and the JDK have deprecated the security manager, and it will eventually be removed with soon to be released JDKs. That's why all the references to the security manager were removed from the relevant security specs. Now let's see what changes in Jakarta Security 4. First of all, there's an API to handle multiple authentication mechanisms and also change from one or use another one as a fallback. There are qualifiers for built-in authentication mechanisms. A new type of identity store was introduced, the in-memory identity store, which is particularly handy not only for testing, but also for scenarios where in a distributed cloud or serverless environment, you may not need to set up external resources like LDAP or a database, because you can simply create your identity store in memory. Of course, for real-life scenarios, it may not always be as useful, but especially for development and testing, it's very handy because it requires less boilerplate and configuration before you can actually use your identity store. And of course, the security manager references were all removed. Here's an example for using multiple authentication mechanisms. So in one, you can just use the form authentication mechanism, while through another endpoint, you can use the JWT authentication mechanism. Which is actually still work in progress, but this work is being done in the microprofile JWT bridge, which sits between Jakarta security as an extension mechanism and uses the microprofile JWT spec. At the moment, it's still in development, but with the next major microprofile version, 8.0, this should be released and become available, and microprofile 8 is also expected to use Jakarta EE 11. So here's how you can use the in-memory identity store. Just like the same annotations that you would use, for example, with the DB or LDAP identity store. So let's have a look at Jakarta Authentication, which of course saw the smallest changes as mentioned. So removing references to Security Manager throughout all of the specs. And there has been removal of technical debt, especially in the TCK, where some earlier TCKs were still using and Java test. It's sort of a heritage from the early days when all these specs were still defined by the Java, cleaned up and removed and properly replaced by a Maven and JUnit test harness combination. Jakarta authorization also saw several changes related to Java SE. So the Java SE policy centered around Security Manager was replaced by a Jakarta EE policy. You can also register the policies now programmatically instead of just in a declarative way. And some convenience methods make the API easier to use. And of course, the Security Manager references related to the changed policy and the overall necessity were also removed from Jakarta Authorization 3.0. Here's how you can add custom policies programmatically in your code. So for example, for roles allowed, you would have the default behavior using the original policy. And you can then override it for custom behavior or behavior that's domain specific. Here, for example, we have a method that checks whether an action is performed during working hours. And so that's, for example, similar to the access in an office building when certain people may not be allowed to access the building after hours, so after the regular working hours are over or on weekends or at night. And this is a comparable feature in the software where you could basically say, okay, our working hours are at a certain time, and if the request to access a certain service is happening after or before those working hours, then you get an error page that tells you when the working hours are and to please come back when they start again. Many of these examples are included in a book that I wrote together with Arjan, who's the spec lead for the security specs, and Theo Baez. Although the book was published shortly before Jakarta EE 10 was released, the examples are all matching Jakarta EE 10, and as soon as 11 goes live, we will also upgrade them, especially with regards to some of the changes that you've seen. In the meantime, I happen to write another book where parts, especially the security frameworks and security standards, also refer to Jakarta security. And that book is specialized in using Java and Jakarta EE in a social context to interact with social networks and APIs like Google, Facebook, Meta, X, Mastodon, and several others. And there are also examples how to use Jakarta security with the OpenID Connect authentication mechanism to authenticate against Google and other APIs. Okay, so as we are already on the Q&A page, there's a question: what are the plans in future for Jakarta security, particularly version 12? Well, one thing that I already mentioned is the unification of the specs, where authentication and authorization would pretty much be melded and emerged into the main security spec, and you will probably just see one spec because the others already are mostly used under the hood. Others, of course, you can use that through the extension mechanism, is the JWT support. And whenever, for example, a configuration mechanism that's developed under Jakarta configuration becomes available, we also expect to integrate that into the security configuration for easier and more convenient configuration. Another possible aspect is also the use of NoSQL databases via Jakarta Data and eventually, with 12, we expect that the Jakarta NoSQL spec will hopefully be ready to join the platform and the release train. So you could also use NoSQL databases for an identity store instead of relational databases.